Hello everyone and welcome back to another Babbling Irons breakdown video with myself and Mike today. And this is an interesting one. It's a rumour that's maybe gone around for about 6 months now. Will Steele has come out. He had that amazing story last season with Rems. He's continued this season to perform pretty well. Still only 31 years old, a real prospect, and obviously a West Ham fan, seen in the stands last week for our match. So people are putting two and two together as to maybe this could be a potential replacement for David Moyes at the end of the season should his contract expire. So we're going to kind of break down Will Steele and how he's kind of playing with Rem, how they're playing this season in comparison to us. And we'll give our final verdict on whether we think it would be a good move for the club to pursue him as a manager, because ultimately it's a pretty big step for him at such a young age. So let's start with a breakdown, Mike, of how he's performed so far at Rems. I think he's had 42 matches, won 19, lost 11, drawn 12, averaging 1.64 points per game, which is pretty solid. Last season, we saw him play 4-2-3-1 a lot. Actually, what's quite interesting is the last few games he shifted to a back three, and it's maybe something a lot of Moyes critiques didn't like about what Moyes did as well when we went to a back three. And people want to see that aggressive front foot football, but maybe Will Steele isn't that type of manager just yet, and he's maybe trying to show a bit more flexibility in his early development. So what have you made of Will Steele so far as a manager? He's still so young, but he's shown a lot of promising potential already at Rems.
Yeah, and before we get into that, I will say, the idea of going to a back three is defensive is a bit of a misnomer. It's all about how you deploy it. Patrice Evra, for instance, talked about a back three when he was at Juventus. It deployed in the right way, it's a very attacking one, because actually what you're doing is pushing more players up the field. But what I think Will Steele has shown is that he's not wedded to a particular formation as such. His preference has been during his time to pretty much play in back four. However, he's looked at his team. He's looked at the last few games, which was against Lorient, PSG, and also against Nantes, who are arguably, kind of bigger teams than Rem. And he's decided to go for that little bit of solidity at the back. But it also means, again, you could be very aggressive. Your fullbacks, push them really high. Interestingly, they have a former youth player from West Ham who went to Man City, currently playing there. He's played 9 games and scored a goal for them as well at left back. So he's not afraid to give youth a chance and play youth. We saw that with Balogun last season. I think it was 27 goals Balogun scored last year. And this is a team that were very good structurally in defence. However, they were fantastic and blistering in the counter-attack. And also they were good and secure in possession. It was, I think at times it was talked about their defensive solidity probably more than needed to be spoken about, because they were a good footballing team and they had some really good central midfielders and a couple of players that we talked about during the time that could actually be really interesting players for West Ham, because they would have been essentially inexpensive players. However, they've shown themselves to be really strong, really good midfielders. And that's what you want. Sometimes you need those players that maybe aren't very showy. And that's the thing with Will Steele's team. There's not really any players that you look at particularly and go, then big names, bar last season where you had Balogun. But they're an incredibly functional, well-oiled team that understand their roles almost to a T, which has allowed them to really punch above their weight in the last 2 seasons under Will Steele. And he's done, an incredible job. Obviously, there was much made about his football manager experience, but he's done a lot of groundwork prior to all of these conversations around football manager and that kind of helping his career.
Yeah, and it looks like it's continued as well into this season. Rem currently sit 5th in Ligue 1 on 20 points from 12 matches, won 6, lost 4. I think they're the joint 3rd top scorers in the league with 17 goals. So that kind of tells you about, how he gets the best out of his attacking players. And, also defensively, they're not doing too bad either. But they've only kept 4 clean sheets out of 12 so far this season. So, again, maybe that's an area where he needs to improve on for a bit of his coaching. But again, like you mentioned, he's a bit more expansive, and you can kind of see the difference in possession. Interestingly, they're not dominating the ball, just under 50% possession on average per game at 49%. but that's still quite significantly higher than what we've achieved so far this season in the Premier League. So comparatively speaking, he does like to keep the ball a lot more than David Moyes, and that's a big kind of difference in their style. But what would you pin that down? So, if we're looking at this season, what would you pin the main differences as in terms of what David Moyes does in his approach and what Will Still does in his approach? Because they are two quite different managers. But do you think Will Still will be able to kind of translate his game into the West Ham squad that we currently have?
Yeah, I think Will Still probably allows a bit more expressionism in his team. He does kind of a bit more positional play. Obviously, with Moyes, it's quite functional. There is, positional play a part of it. Players have to be in certain positions to receive the ball. We tend to, in possession, play over back three, two kind of holding, and then, a front kind of five as such, which is pretty much the bog standard way you'll see any kind of most European teams, because they play that positional play. So when you're attacking, you tend to go into that kind of default kind of setup.
Yeah.
What I find interesting is when you look at Will Steele's team, and Moyes is deemed to be far more defensive. However, when you look at the kind of average this year in the Premier League, we're looking at 1.83 goals conceded per game, which is slightly better than what our XG expected goals to be conceded, which is 1.93.
That's high. That's high.
It is. And when you compare that to what our expected goals is, which is 1.54 per game, then you start to think that there's a level of unsustainability in our performance, because if on average, our opponents should be outscoring us, and we are underscoring, and I know it sounds almost infinitesimally small to say it's 0.40, but that is a big difference in football. That 0.40 is possibly the difference between one goal, 1-0 victory, or 1-0 win for the opposition. We are exceeding, so to speak, our XG. But again, that's the point. If we are exceeding on both,
is that a bad thing, Mike? Is that a bad thing to exceed XG like that? Because last season we did. I spoke to you a lot as well about XG, and we had our conversations on it. And I was kind of saying, on XG we're actually performing a lot better than what the results are. But this season it's kind of flipped around where, okay, we're outperforming our XG, and players like Bowen are scoring the goals where he should be. So is there a case that that's not actually that much of a negative?
So it's a catch-20, because it's one of those ones that you would say, arguably statistically, it's not sustainable. If you are overachieving, then you are simply that. So the argument that you are going to continue to overachieve isn't necessarily something that is something we do as a club. However, what it doesn't account for is maybe players are more proficient in certain areas, and some of the shots that we're having, actually we are highly skilled, and that's the problem with some of those statistics. In that the XG one is a very generalized piece, and there are other levels it goes to when you look at certain players as to certain places where they shoot, maybe they score more often in those kind of places. So it suggests that we are overperforming from a scoring point of view. We are slightly better than what we expected to concede. So
is it better to focus on the defensive stuff and kind of highlight, because our XG conceded is actually really high this season at 1.9 or something you said. That's maybe the alarm for concern, because we're meant to be, known for our defensive performance.
Yeah, exactly. We're meant to be a very defensive team, and we're almost conceding. Well, arguably, we should be conceding almost 2 goals per game on average.
It's too high.
When you look at it in terms of what Will Steele's doing in League One, again, you can talk about there's a lack of maybe the same level of competition. They are at 1.3, so it's marked difference. It's almost to the 1 as opposed to the 2.
Yeah.
And they are, from a goals point of view, they are exceeding as many as they should be conceding. So that's obviously a great trajectory to be on, because it's suggesting that they are creating more high quality chances against the opposition. Whereas what it says to us is that we are not. The opposition are able to create more chances. They should be scoring fairly freely. And if you go down that XG conversation, we are arguably going to lose more than we will win, because the statistics point in that direction.
So if we're looking at kind of the style differences between both Will Steele and David Moyes, then, based on this season, obviously we can see the possession stats. Will Steele's team has a little bit more, well, quite a lot more of the ball than we do, which isn't hard to do at the moment with our low possession stats. But, aesthetically looking at it, structurally, what are the kind of key differences between the two managers and how they set up?
Yeah, I think Will Steele encourages a lot more. They're far more convincing in possession, in the sense of, they will look to pass a lot more. They're almost about 60, 70 more passings per game than us.
Yeah.
They have similarities in the sense of they tend to like to keep a good structure, be strong defensively, and then break out, which has been arguably our real kind of key under Moyes.
Yeah.
And that's when we've generally looked best, is when we've been that counter-attacking team. So it kind of fits within that mould. What I would say is that Will Steele is probably showing that he can be adaptive. Now, we have seen that with Moyes at times, but I think there's maybe some loyalties to players that are maybe, allowing certain players to be kind of played. Like we see with Danny Ings, the consistent using on Danny Ings is almost baffling.
That's a separate video. That's a separate video.
yeah, exactly. But, we have seen Moyes be very flexible in the time. We can't say that he hasn't. He has shown tactical flexibility. I think where the issue has been is that we don't necessarily see sometimes in possession that tactical flexibility kind of matched with a level of freedom that some players maybe need. And we are trying to do this positional play. We don't necessarily have players that are moving into the right positions, or maybe don't have the skill set in really to which to execute these kind of patterns in which to play through and pass through. That could be part of training. That could be part of application from the players. It's a bit of a, depending, I think, where you sit in that conversation is maybe some people go, it's a coachable thing and they're not being coached it. Others will say, actually, maybe these players are just not capable, and actually the manager's doing what he can in which to skirt over their deficiencies. And I think with Will Steele, he has done incredible work with Rem in that he's got a team that understand their roles. They have good kind of movement and alignment, particularly in midfield. They tend to have kind of this kind of deep double pivot who work really well. They're incredibly hardworking. They are, kind of arguably monsters defensively, but they are able to kind of break forward, and they also have the passing ability as well. So it would have been interesting had we gone for one of their midfielders, especially defensive ones, because they could have potentially done that role that maybe we see with Souček, but they're more proficient in possession as well, which would have given an increase. Obviously, with Souček, as we know, he's a very accomplished finisher in the right position, and obviously we owe him a debt of gratitude for the last win, although he could have had a hat trick. But it's one of those where we arguably have players that would suit what Will Steele likes to do and how he likes to play. He would maybe allow a little bit more freedom and artistry. We have seen Paqueta given more freedom recently. However, as we've said, he tends to play better when we can get him more central, is when we see a lot more of a much better Paqueta. But obviously we're trying to cram players in rather than maybe looking at how do those players kind of work from a relationship point of view on the pitch, and how do they look to change things. So I sent you a video the other day about relationism in football, which is the whole different concept to positional play, which is basically about players and their relationships together, how they interconnect. So a great example is how you have players play more on the cuff when they really can't have a good in sync. So Emerson and Paqueta is less a positional play kind of two players. It's that relational kind of process where they play those one touches, playing off the cuff and kind of condensing in an area rather than kind of looking to, if I go into this position, I now need to drop into this slot in which to open up spaces, being happy to play in those really tight areas, and we can flicks and all of those kind of things, which are, I suppose, superb and infuriating at the same time.
I think with kind of what we've mentioned on Will Steele, it will be people will maybe wanted to see the likes of Michael Carrick or someone like Vincent Company come through the door, but I think one of the key differences between those and what Will Still can do is maybe Will Still shown a little bit more flexibility and maybe a little bit more he could adapt easier to how we play to starting off because Carrick, you look at his Middlesbrough team this season, they started really poor but they've started
Yeah.
picking up, absolutely dominated the ball, absolutely every game. Always have more possession than the other team, a high 60%. And Company was like that last season with Burnley in the Championship, and this season we're seeing a completely different outlook. And they're conceding goals left, right, and centre, and that lack of experience when it comes to going into the Premier League and adapting has shown. And so that's my positive for Will Still, as to why I would maybe favour him coming in if it was to be like someone like that.
I think
My
it's also
only concern,
League One, which is I know some people call it a farmers league, but it is an incredibly competitive league with very good players. And whenever
Yeah.
we're linked to new players, by and large, it is from that league. And many players that we talked about that we'd like to see at West Ham also have come from.
I mean, you only have to look at Paqueta. He's the one that came from there. So there's definitely players there. But yeah, I think my reservation with this is, he still is only 31. We're going to be in a little bit of a tough situation in the summer if Moyes' contract does expire, because Tim Steiner's going to have to identify a list of candidates, which I'm sure he's already doing in the background. I know he wants the likes of Xabi Alonso, but it's very unlikely to go and get. But you never know with Tim. But Will Still is more of a realistic target, and realistically someone who could come in, and I think that instant connection with the fans would make it easier for him, and it would give him a lot more time to buy over the course of however long he stays at West Ham, because I think fans will be a lot less critical of him just because of that connection and coming in a young. That's how I feel. What would your thoughts be if Will Still was to come in at the end of the year? Would you be happy with it?
I think I would, because I think it's showing that we're trying to think of a long term. I think for it to be accepted, it needs to be talked about as a longer term project. So there is going to be changes in personnel. We are going to maybe look to a younger kind of set of players, which can potentially mean there is going to be some inconsistencies in performances, and there is going to be some
similar to Arteta with Arsenal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing. Sometimes if you look at, say, I think Arteta is the perfect example. They went to that model of really only going for players of 25 and under.
Yeah.
So for the first 2 years, it was arguably a bit tumultuous, especially for Arsenal fans.
Yeah.
However, once those players have understood what it is, you also kind of weed out the players you don't need or fit that kind of model. Then you can then start to really express and play within that. I think that's the way in which you promote Will Still.
Yeah.
I don't personally think he'll be a manager we'll go for. I think he may be one that was on the list and one that we look at. Even Carrick, I think, is probably on. If we were to talk about lists, I would say he's probably on a B list.
Yeah.
And I think there are others that we are maybe looking at. Maybe one from South America, one from who's currently managing in Southern Europe.
I'm sure it will come out.
Yeah, and I've been told a couple of names. I don't know if they're true, but
Yeah.
Like I say, I think there'll be one maybe in Southern Europe that we'll probably look at. There'll be maybe one in South America, and then there will obviously be potentially maybe one or two bigger names in Europe we'll try for. I think Alonso has now been and gone. I think our opportunity for that was in the summer. We decided to stick with Moyes. That's fair enough. I think that's it's probably a right decision. Some will say no, some will say it is. But I think I would be happy with Will Still.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't expect us to be pushing where we have been under Moyes, at least for a good 1 or 2 years as he assimilates into the Premier League, and also whilst we maybe change our philosophy as a football club. I think that's over the next 2 years. I think we're going to see that change quite a lot.
I think that's the biggest challenge, isn't it? We're gonna, if Moyes does go at the end of the year, it's going to be that change, that change of identity, that change of what we've become accustomed to for the last 3 years, and has worked so well. Won us a European trophy. The players know exactly what they're doing in a Moyes system. When you bring someone else in like that, it can change things and it can take time. So, yeah, Will Still, let's see how he does for the remainder of the season. We'll keep a close eye on it, and if he does continue to perform, then it might just be the new West Ham manager next summer if Moyes doesn't replace his contract at the end of the year. So, yeah, let us know what your thoughts are on Will Still so far as a manager. Would you like to see him at West Ham? You know, the West Ham fan himself, 31 years old. Do you think he'd be a success at the London Stadium? Let us know in the comments. Leave a like on the video, as always. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. And Mike, until next time,
Come on, you
come on, you
Irons.
Irons.